Uncovering history, the founding fathers and those in their shadows, the Battle of Trenton, now or never. Tuesday, December 24th, 1776, the eve of the most holy day, Christmas. 3 regiments of Hessian soldiers totaling about 1,800 men had recently descended upon and chased out almost all the inhabitants of Trenton, New Jersey, occupying it as a buffer to keep the American rebels from re-entering the area. They were led by German Colonel Johann Rawl. Rawl was a seasoned Hessian army veteran who had fought in a number of wars, including the 7 Years' War, and was placed in command of Trenton by General William Howe. Meanwhile, on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, roughly 10 miles from Trenton, Washington and his senior aides were planning the unthinkable, a surprise offensive attack against the Hessians. Washington knew it was now or never, as the Americans would attack the Hessians on the morning of December 26, with the understanding that this pivotal battle would surely decide the fate of America. A victory would tip the scales in America's favor and rejuvenate the cause. However, failure to overtake the Hessians and suffer defeat in Trenton would collapse the army, sending a signal of surrender to every American that supported the cause, and a guarantee that no future foreign aid would arrive from France. Washington had the support of both his closest companions and his men to press forward with the attack under the banner of victory or death. It was indeed now or never, as many of the soldiers' enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. One weathered soldier, writing to his wife, said, "I cannot desert a man, and it would certainly be desertion in a court of law, who has deserted everything in service for his country." Prior to the war, Washington could have politely declined the offer by Congress to lead the Continental Army as commanding general against the British, and quietly retired at Mount Vernon as one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. Washington, who was a farmer through and through, loved nothing more than to be at home doing what he loved most, farming. This was readily apparent in many of his letters home during the course of the war, in which he wrote to Lund Washington regarding the status of the farm. Washington would often give directions to Lund on what to do as if he were present at Mount Vernon. As Ron Chernow so interestingly observed, Washington seemed to momentarily escape the dreads of war while writing home and seemingly dreaming of his farm at Mount Vernon. But Washington also recognized and believed that service to his nation and countrymen, along with their freedom, took priority and was wholly worth dying for. It was the selfless nature of Washington that made him great, as he took no salary for his sacrifice. He never forced a man to go an inch further than himself, and was always in the thick of battle leading the attack. With the gathering of Washington's most trusted men, Knox, Putnam, Greene, Mercer, Glover, Ewing, and Cadwalader, the plans for the attack were precisely laid out and to be executed at all costs. Under no circumstances, except upon death, was the mission to be aborted. Even an ailing Colonel Alexander Hamilton mustered up enough strength to take part in this most spectacular of battles. There were to be 3 different crossings of the Delaware on that Christmas night. Washington and 2,400 of his men would cross at McConkey's Ferry, while the other 2 regiments led by Colonel James Cadwalader and General James Ewing would cross further down the river. The plan of attack was for Cadwalader to take 1,200 men to the north end of Trenton to harass and prevent any retreating Hessians from escape, while General Ewing and his force of 800 men would position themselves at Assunpink Bridge to prevent any retreat. As the sun slowly settled behind the tall Pennsylvanian oaks on Christmas Day, the temperature quickly tumbled below freezing, and the wind suddenly shifted from the west to northeast, prompting many to surmise a nor'easter storm was quickly approaching. From the outset, the rebels immediately fell behind schedule, being slowed by the storm as some 2,400 severely fatigued men, horses, and artillery were being pelted by freezing rain and bitterly cold wind, which soon transitioned to snow. One soldier wrote in his diary, "It blew a perfect hurricane." As untimely as the arrival of the storm was and was perceived to be, perhaps the hand of Providence was shining on Washington and his men in a most peculiar way. Many myths exist that the Hessians were hung over and sleeping in after a night of Christmas celebration when the Americans attacked. But the Hessians were quite privy regarding a potential rebel attack on Trenton and were on high alert. Colonel Rawl had been briefed by several defective American traitors of a planned attack, and from a British spy that had infiltrated the American ranks and disclosed Washington's plan of attack on Trenton. But in an almost sneering manner, Rawl said, "Let them come." Rawl and the Hessians had summarily defeated the Americans 5 times prior to Trenton, and didn't view them as a threat, much less an army. Second, the enormous nature of the storm further bolstered Rawl's opinion that an attack would not be possible given the conditions and state of the Americans, as some of them were barely clothed. But in an almost providential act from God, the bitterly cold wind, blowing sleet and snow, actually acted as cover both visually and audibly from the Hessians as the Americans were poised to march and attack Trenton. But first, the Americans had to cross the river. Peering over the banks of the icy Delaware, Washington, with perfect posture and countenance, sat upon Nelson, his favorite horse, for hours as Henry Knox boomed out orders, while the men tediously boarded the boats to cross the river. Many, not knowing how to swim, were in a state of panic, as they were packed like sardines into the boats. Several men did in fact fall into the icy river and were luckily fished out as they sat shivering on the other side, waiting for what seemed like an eternity for the remaining boats to cross. The boats the Army would use to cross the now ice-dammed river were impressive flat-bottomed boats known as Durham boat, spanning between 40 and 60 feet in length and capable of holding up to 15 tons. Here, yet again, George Washington called upon the services of John Glover and his men to save the cause as they navigated and steered the enormous boats around the fast-moving ice and howling cold wind. Many believed that without Glover and his men, the mission would have failed miserably. Timing was everything for Washington, and while he had initially planned for his army to be on the New Jersey side of the Delaware by 11, they instead fell some 5 hours behind as the last boat safely crossed around 3 a.m. The entire premise of the attack hinged on the element of surprise, as Washington wanted his army to arrive in Trenton sometime before sunrise. Now, with a 10-mile trek ahead of them, that would be impossible. The men slowly marched through the snowstorm, many without boots as trails of blood stained the freshly fallen snow. Several patriots perished en route to Trenton from exhaustion and frostbite and were sadly left behind. Making matters worse, further down the river, Colonel Cadwalader and General Ewing's forces were unable to cross the Delaware because of the conditions and were forced to abort the mission. Instantaneously, Cadwalader sent a courier to Washington informing him of the dire circumstances. Washington had to make an immediate decision. Reacting quickly, Washington had made up his mind, victory or death, and pressed on with his men to attack Trenton. As the clouds began to dissipate and the wind died down, the first rays of sunshine began to glisten on the freshly fallen snow. Now, with a light breeze at the rebels' backs, the army continued to press on, and after some 10 grueling miles of marching, they arrived at the outskirts of Trenton. Miraculously, the Americans had not been spotted by the enemy. Washington would later write, "As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events." As Washington and his men emerged from the woods around 8 a.m., they were divided into 3 companies that split off with Washington in the middle. Suddenly there was a thunderous boom from the cannons of Henry Knox that were aimed directly down King's and Queen Streets, with the likes of Alexander Hamilton and James Monroe in the thick of battle. As the surprised Hessians shouted and scrambled racing to their muskets, the Americans charged the city. The Hessians shouted in German, "Vorwärts! Vorwärts! Forward! Forward!" But the charge of the American soldiers prevented the Hessians from gathering into any type of formation. Even though many of the Americans' muskets were incapable of firing because of wet flintlocks, they still had the Hessians reeling. As some of the retreating Hessians headed north towards Assunpink Bridge, seeking a path to escape, they were met by Captain Sullivan's regiment and repulsed back. By this time, the smoke had filled the air from musket and cannon fire, awakening Colonel Rawl, who finally emerged from bed as he had spent the previous evening playing cards and drinking until midnight. As Rawl slowly dressed himself and mounted his horse, he was first seen on King Street. Rawl was noticeably taken back that the city had instantly become a battlefield. American rebels were now peeking behind barrels, positioning themselves along fences, shooting from the inside of homes and roofs as they took aim at the Hessian captains. The musket fire was intense as lead balls whistled down the streets, peppering houses, bouncing off headstones, and ripping through windows. Some of Rawl's men managed to position themselves behind the gravestones at St. Michael's Church, but they were no match for the Americans as they began to close in on and surround them. Some of the Hessians managed to get off a few rounds of cannon fire, but they were quickly met with twice the repulse as the American batteries smothered them with cannon fire and grape shot. Some of the horses were even blown to pieces by the intense cannon fire. As Rawl spun his horse up King Street towards St. Michael's, he shouted, "Varas! Varas! Advance! Advance!" making every attempt to counter General Greene's men. Rawl successfully brought several regiments towards an apple orchard, but his effort proved to be fruitless. As Washington peered down from the hilltop, he shouted orders and pressed Rawl and his remaining men back to the center of the city. With one last effort, Rawl said, "All of my grenadiers, forward!" But this too proved to be fruitless, as General Sullivan's men laid into the direction of Rawl with a hail of musket fire. Suddenly, Rawl reeled back on his horse and one of his officers shouted, "My lord! My lord!" Rawl was hit by 2 musket balls. Falling to the ground, Rawl was carried off to the Methodist church down the street. The battle was over. After roughly 2 hours of unceasing cannon and musket fire, some of the Hessians slowly began to raise their flags of surrender, flinging their muskets to the ground and cutting their cartridge packs from their necks. The victorious Americans cheered and shouted as the sounds reverberated down the streets of Trenton. Immediately, some of the soldiers began to relieve the clothing and boots from many of the dead Hessian soldiers. Barrels of rum were seized by the Americans, who began to immediately intoxicate themselves, filling their boots with rum. Washington must have beamed with pride as the Americans just won their first battle, and did so decisively. General Howe's momentum literally evaporated within hours, as a significant portion of his army had either been killed or now captured by an amateur army, and as one Londoner said of Washington, a bungling beginner.